stand on the shoulders of others. My father is the person here in the center of the picture. And I've written my first blogs this summer. My office encouraged me to write a blog about segregated swimming pools. And then I wrote one about barbecue traditions. My mother was from Eastern North Carolina. My father was from Tulsa. Very different barbecue tradition. But the next blog I'm working on is actually about my grandfather, who was born in southern Oklahoma. His family got there as slaves to Chickasaw Indians and got there through the Trail of Tears. And they established themselves as ranchers, black cowboys, initially enslaved, and then enslaved under the name Bernie. And then my great-grandfather ran away to fight for the Union forces and changed his name from Bernie to Franklin. But the Franklins were black cowboys in the Arbuckle Mountains in Hennepin, Oklahoma, and they drove their cattle up here. So I was rereading the beginning of my grandfather's autobiography, and he talks about coming into Kansas with the cattle. So he was here before all of us. I was at a conference of the Association of the Study of African American Life and History last week in Pittsburgh, and I mentioned that I was previously in Barbados at another conference and headed to Wichita, and my friends said to me, well, you know, Ron Walters was from Wichita. And so I Googled him in the few moments before beginning the talk tonight, and indeed he was born in Wichita in July 1938, and as president of the local NAACP Youth Council, led the Dockham Drug Store sit-in in July of 1958, leading to the desegregation of drugstores in this city. So a museum of history and culture has many stories to tell. And our challenge is to try to access all the different stories of the different time periods. And I'm going to tell you the history of this museum, and then we're going to look at some images from our photographic collections, and then I'm going to end it with a video of our groundbreaking ceremony, which was in February of this year. Now, some of you may know that this museum's story goes back to Civil War veterans who wanted a museum built in Washington to tell the story of the contribution of African Americans to this nation's history. Well, that was 150 years ago. Long time coming. So when I started at the institution in 1987, shortly thereafter was the first commission to look at the issue of a National African American Museum. Those efforts fizzled for reasons I won't go into now. And then this was the idea initially of the late Congressman Mickey Leland. And when Mickey Leland passed, John Lewis took up the idea of building this National African American Museum. And every Congress, he would submit legislation for the creation of the museum. And finally, he was joined by Congressman J.C. Watt, and they proposed legislation in the House. And Senators Max Cleland and Sam Brownback were the Senate sponsors of the legislation. The commission then was appointed by President Bush, included, as you've heard, a blue ribbon group, including Eric Sexton and Beverly Thompson of Topeka. So Kansas was well represented, and then the senators' support all the way along in the process. Now, the commission was initially staffed by the National Park Service, and the conclusion of the commission was that this new museum needed to be created in Washington under the auspices of the Smithsonian so it would have access to federal funds. They didn't feel that an institution this significant could really have consistent funding as a private institution and needed that federal baseline budget to which, as you know, all museums have to raise money for exhibitions, for acquisitions, for educational programs. But at least to have our power plant, our salary, our physical plant assured by federal funds was essential. This commission had studied 9 sites on or around the National Mall. And when President Bush signed the authorization, they gave the Smithsonian the charge to narrow those 9 sites to 5, to do feasibility studies to determine which would be the best site for the museum, to create a board of directors, to hire a director, to create a staff. And it's at that moment that I requested, as a federal employee, to be detailed to the team. So we started as a team of 4. The director, the receptionist who was a temp, the person who was initially hired to staff the board, and I was the 4th employee. Now we're up to 80. We have contractors, we have interns, and we hope to double the size of our staff in the next fiscal year when we get past the continuing resolution. Now, when you're creating a museum, you have to decide what's going to be in it. And it's a museum of history and culture of the African American community. It's a huge topic. So how do you divide it into sections to decide what exhibitions you're going to have? Do you need 1 theater? Do you need 2? Are you going to have a cafeteria? Are you going to have a library? Are you going to have rental space so you can generate money for cocktail parties or meetings or receptions? Are you going to do weddings or not? All of these things have to be part of your deliberations. And so over 2 years, we developed something called a program document. And that entailed all of the things that we hoped that this museum would be able to do. Because when you're giving a team of architects the opportunity to bid on such a design project, they have to know what they're designing. So it was a huge 2-volume document called the program document. And the Smithsonian also, in deciding the site, the ideal site, chose a site at the base of the Washington Monument. They felt that it would be prominent, it would be adjacent to the other Smithsonian museums, and that having a place so visible, when you look at the front of the White House, this building will be behind it on the side. So all the architects in the world wanted to compete for this project to have a building so visible. So 23 firms competed. Our panel of judges whittled that down to 6. And then the 6 firms had to produce models and detailed designs of what it would look like. And those of us who are staff, members of the public, got a chance to go and look at these designs. And you'll see at the end of my talk what the final design looks like. It's a $500 million project. Congress committed to pay for half. The Congress we're dealing with now is not always generous, let me put it that way. We've been successful in raising close to $100 million on the private sector side. The biggest grants have come from the Lilly and Gates Foundation, $10 million each. We've gotten $5 million chunks from Boeing, Target, Walmart, Ford, and Rockefeller Foundations. And the number $3 to $4 million gifts, Caterpillar, Kellogg. And then a number of individuals and families have given $1 million each. Oprah Winfrey's on our board. We hope that she will consider giving more than her initial $1 million because we know she can. We broke ground in February, and we're about 30 to 40 feet down now. We're going to have our two of our levels will be below ground, one holding our history galleries, our theater, our cafeteria, and then the lower floor will be for the systems and the kitchen and the loading dock, et cetera. Now, that's the physical building. but really what will it look at and what is its mission? As Eric so clearly stated to us over lunch today, this had to be a national museum. It had to look at American history. And so the premise of the museum is that you cannot tell the history of the United States without the active history or culture of the United States, without the active role of African Americans in shaping that history and culture. This is a museum that will give you the opportunity to look at American history and culture through an African American lens or perspective. What did the Civil War look like from the African American point of view? What did immigration look like from the African American point of view? What did theater or film, or in this case, photography, look like through the African American perspective? This is a place of collaboration. We're not trying to do this on our own. We're a national museum, but we need help from other institutions. We are to place the story of African Americans in an international context. People think of the United States having a large African American community. But from 1500 to almost mid-19th century, only about 500,000 Africans come directly to the United States. 1 million are sent to Jamaica, 1 million are sent to Cuba, 1 million are sent to Haiti, close to 6 million to Brazil. The African American community here reproduce naturally births over deaths sooner than anywhere else in the hemisphere, allowing our community to grow. But many millions more went elsewhere in the hemisphere, and those stories are not known. So part of our situating the story in an international context is for people to understand the relationship between the United States and Brazil, the United States and the Spanish-speaking areas. Because now we have people from throughout the hemisphere who are coming to the United States, and they need to know how our stories are linked and intertwined. My role as Director of Partnerships and International Programs is to cultivate long-term relationships with universities, where the students of the future are coming, where the research is being done, with museums that have collections of interest to us. Museums function in a reciprocal world. You want to do an exhibition on Gordon Parks, well, you need to borrow Gordon Parks' works from other institutions. We want to do an exhibition on African American businesses, well, then you need to go to places where there are people who are specialists in African American business, don't we? The archives in the United States, in France, in Britain, in the Caribbean, in Africa, have the information that's important to understanding our story. So we have to develop relationships with those kind of institutions and with organizations of all kinds. Because African Americans have been particularly creative in initiating institutions, be they fraternities and sororities, professional organizations, civic associations, social organizations, to help us adapt and survive in somewhat hostile environments. Now, to give you an example of how my work takes me to many places, I've been to France several times this year, over this past year. The French commemorate the abolition of slavery and the slave trade every May 10th. So they have a series of conferences and exhibits. And the French brought their first Africans to what is now Louisiana in 1719. So part of our history is not just the British story, but when the French brought the Africans. Next year, Florida is celebrating 500 years of its creation as a Spanish colony. Africans came in 1513 to Florida. So that part of our history is in the Spanish archives and in Spain. And that's what brought Africans to Puerto Rico, to Cuba, to much of South America. It's a Spanish trade. I went to elementary school in New York City. I learned about the Dutch, but they never told us the Dutch brought the Africans to New York in the 1600s. We really had to wait until 1991 when building a federal building in lower Manhattan near Wall Street, this cemetery was unearthed with 20,000 Africans. Cemetery closed in 1759. And these are the Africans who built the wall for which Wall Street is named. And all of New York learned that it had a slave past and that it had Africans in its story from the beginning of the creation of New York City. I was in Brazil in February, and Brazil received close to 6 million Africans. That's larger than any single movement of people, I think, anywhere in the world. And we don't know that story. We don't know it as US citizens. We don't know as inhabitants of this hemisphere that many Africans were taken to Brazil. The American Association of Museums, where I met Priska Barnes, met in Baltimore in August. And museums were created around the United States to begin to tell the African American story, really starting in our historically black colleges and universities in the 19th century. But there's a movement in the mid-20th century to create these community-based African American museums. And the National Museum is the latest of this evolution of museums. Countries around the Caribbean, in Africa, in Europe, are all part of this story. And an organization was created by the late Minister of Tourism of Bermuda called the African Diaspora Heritage Trail Conference for countries to look at what their African heritage story is to interest visitors. That conference just took place in Barbados. Last year it took place in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And so we get to learn different aspects of the dispersal of African people. I attend later this month the Museum Association of the Caribbean, which is meeting in Trinidad. And then I go to New Hampshire for the African American Annual History Conference there. So there are many places where you don't expect this story to be told, where there are interested individuals and institutions with whom we have to collaborate. And so that's my job. Now, when we decided what has to be in this museum, we decided you have to start with the history. You have to have a grounding in the history. And so in this below ground set of galleries, we're going to look at the arrival of Africans from different places, the involvement of Europe in the trade. Most of Europe was involved in the trade. Swiss financing, Vatican's involved in the money. European goods from across the continent are put on the ships that leave from these coastal harbors. But at one point it was Bavarian porcelain and textiles from India and textiles from Europe that fill these ships that then go down the African coast and trade all of these goods, liquor, wine, pewter, enamel, for Africans who are then brought to the different parts of the Americas. And then those ships return to Europe with timber, cotton, rum, sugar, molasses, to feed the European markets and really help initiate industrialization in Europe. So we have the Slavery and Freedom Galleries. Then we look at the period immediately after the Civil War, the struggle against segregation and for civil rights. And then our third gallery looks at the modern period, 1968, up to President Obama's inauguration. The second floor, and I know all you librarians and archivists will be interested in this, houses a resource center where you will be able to not only do research, but access collections in other institutions, such as the Ulrich, such as the Wichita Museum of Art, such as the Kansas African American Museum, and university collections around the country, around the world. That floor will also have a genealogy center, because many people want to know, well, how do I find out who my relatives were? And some of you may not know this, but when the book and movie Roots came out in the 1970s, it inspired Americans of all backgrounds to learn more about their families. And people who work in state and national archives refer to these people seeking their family origins as the genies. And these are Americans looking for their background. So people coming to this museum, whether you're African American or not, can go to the Genealogy Center and learn how to do the research, how to find out about your families. The second floor will also include an education exhibition for 2 to 10-year-olds. Our museum feels, as the Holocaust Museum feels, you need to direct your approach to the youngest visitors. They need to have a different kind of experience than the experience you plan for older people. And that will also have the acronym here, the Center for African American Media Arts. We'll see that again later. We've decided that we really can be useful to the nation in being a place where photography and film collections excel. So you'll see a range of our collections in a moment. The third floor has what we refer to as our community galleries. And the community galleries look at, first, an exhibition called Making a Way Out of No Way. Because whether faced with slavery or faced with segregation, African Americans adapted and created ways to survive and thrive. One of my favorite stories is a story out of St. Louis, where on the Missouri side, it was illegal for African Americans to read, to learn how to read. So people put their children on a barge and floated it out on the Mississippi to the Illinois side and taught them during the day, and then brought the barge back to Missouri at the end of the day. Isn't that brilliant? We have another exhibition called The Power of Place, because the Smithsonian is often criticized for being East Coast centric, just telling the story sort of on the East Coast. But we want people to understand that the experience of African Americans across the nation differs. Every experience is different, and the mix of communities is different in every place. So you have a different dynamic, you have a different story. The story I'm working on most closely, because it's part of my family, is the story of Black Tulsa before, during, and after the 1921 riot. And so we're collecting images, we're collecting the oral histories, we're collecting furniture and burned bricks and the things that actually attest to this history that occurred in Tulsa, and people's defiance in not being run out of Greenwood and rebuilding right where they were. The third floor will also have a military history and a sports history gallery. And the fourth floor for exhibitions is dedicated to culture, where we will have the largest space called Musical Crossroads that will look at African American music and all the influences on it and its influences on other music around the world. We have an art gallery on that space, and we're collecting art from different time periods, both depictions of African Americans and work by African Americans. And then there's a gallery called Cultural Expressions that will look at poetry, theater, dance, architecture, gardening, and my favorite, food. And then we've added an exhibition. When I've been traveling back and forth, I came and found that we're having an exhibition on popular culture. And I had no idea that that was a new space. We'll have a changing art space and a changing exhibition. We've not waited to have a building to show our value to the nation and to Washington. So we began a series of programs, one of which is called Saving African American Treasures. And we come to cities across the country. We came last year to Topeka. And we encourage people to bring things out of their attic, out of their storeroom, to learn what they have. And not its monetary value, because in museums we can't do appraisals. We send you to appraisers. But you may want to know whether what you have is rare. but more importantly, how do you conserve it and how do you preserve it for generations to come? So we work in concert with local institutions, local conservators, local university, public library, and indeed encourage you to come with your children or your grandchildren so they can value what you have in your home and they can learn the stories behind what you have. We also partnered with StoryCorps, which is a nationwide oral history project, which is also intergenerational. You get younger people to interview you, whether they're your neighbors or your relatives or your friends, so they can learn about your history. You get a copy, the Library of Congress gets a copy, and we at the museum get a copy. And we've done that across the nation. I've also been working very recently with the Civil Rights Oral History Project, which is again a Library of Congress partnership. And I'm working with the person who first hired me at the Smithsonian, Bernice Johnson Regan, who founded the group Sweet Honey in the Rock, as we plan a Southwest Georgia Treasures with people who were living there in the early 60s, lost their land, had their churches burned, fought to have the right to vote, and have persevered and continued to live in Southwest Georgia. So in March, we're doing a Saving African American Treasures program for the SNCC Legacy Project in Southwest Georgia. I created a pilot program in Chicago called Saving African American Sacred Spaces, when a church that had been Thomas Dorsey had been music minister for 50 years there. And they had his piano and sheet music and all the programs of the church, the funeral programs, the wedding programs, the recorded sermons, and roofers repairing the roof with torches set the whole building on fire, and they lost everything. So you have a man-made tragedy for an institution. And how do you therefore encourage congregations to preserve what they have, to digitize what they have, to not store the records in the basement, because if the flooding occurs, that's where it gets wet. So you have to work with not necessarily trained archivists, but every congregation has someone or some group of people responsible for the records. So you work with them so that they can save and preserve the history of their institution. We also found out in Chicago that many of the members of congregations were 100 years old and therefore had witnessed the evolution of the last 90 years or so of that community. And so those are oral histories that need to be done while you can capture those memories. Now, when you're creating a museum, even if you're a Smithsonian museum, you can't have a museum without a collection. So we carved out all these different subject areas, and each curator has to go out and find the objects to go in his or her collection, in his or her exhibition. Well, up here you have a sampling of some of the objects we've actually acquired. From your left, this is one of Louis Armstrong's trumpets. And when you're a museum, you hope that people will give things to you. If you're the Smithsonian, they say, well, that will cost you X amount. And then there's a possibility of borrowing things long term, but you have to pay to preserve somebody else's stuff. And our director really doesn't like that, but some things are not for sale. And if you want it, you then have to negotiate a 30-year loan, 20-year loan. I'm sorry, I've forgotten the name of the artist. But since we're a museum of history and culture, in the history galleries, we're trying to show what culture was in the 18th century, what music people listened to in the 19th century, what they wore in the early 20th century. And this is a painting of a protest from the 1960s. So we wanted to show the art, not just talk about the politics of the civil rights movement, but show how it was depicted in painting. It's a very famous Charles White drawing, and the next one, the man with his hands up, that's my dad. And the next one. I was telling some of you this earlier. Michael Jackson's glove went up for auction. You can't tell the late 20th century story of African American music without having something of Michael Jackson's. So we sent our curator, our music curator, Dwan Larice, up to the auction in New York. The glove, as you know, gloves usually come in pairs, right? But this is a glove, one, went for $750,000. We don't have the glove. Somebody else got that glove. So we got a fedora. So that's a Michael Jackson fedora. Cost less than $750,000. A man woke up one morning and learned that his aunt had passed, and she had willed him 39 objects that belonged to Harriet Tubman. That is Harriet Tubman's hymnal. She got a shawl from Queen Victoria. We have her fork and knife. We have pictures of her that are very rare. We have her funeral program. We have pictures from her funeral. And this person was worried that once he inherited this, it would burn up in his house would catch fire and burn up. He put it in his bank vault, thought the bank might get robbed. So he called us. He said, please, take this out of my hands. This was a gift, thank goodness. So we have 39 objects that belong to Harriet Tubman. And then, of course, remnants of segregation are rare to find. And you wouldn't believe it, there's black market in these things. There are people who fake, you know this, Prisca? People who fake artifacts, chains, all kinds of things. So you have to have people authenticate that this is really 18th century this or 19th century that. Because, you know, if you could, I know that in the African art world, there are terracotta pottery from the Nok pottery. People take fragments of the real thing, grind it up, shape it into newly made objects that look like the Nok pottery and sell it to you as though it's contemporary. So there's a lot of, you have to be very careful about your purchase. So that's a colored water fountain. So in addition to collecting, and each curator has an advisory team about where you look for materials, making sure you get the story right, making sure that your scholarship is up to date. We have a scholarly advisory committee, which my late father used to chair, and these are mostly academics. And they say, oh, no. You can't tell it like that. You haven't read so-and-so? You need to have the most recent scholarship so that your exhibition that opens in 2015 will be based on the most recent information that we have. So in addition to collecting and having these programs, we opened a space in American history, the National Museum of American History, which is next door to our construction site. And we've had a series of exhibitions, one of which your speaker coming later this month, Deborah Willis, curated. And the first one was called Let Your Motto Be Resistance. And other Smithsonian museums have collections that would be of interest, but may not necessarily be shown to the public. So we had Deb Willis go into the National Portrait Gallery and pull out a dozen portraits of African Americans, the earliest being an 1851 photograph of Frederick Douglass, through many people of the 20th century, people you may have heard of, but images of them that you had never seen. Langston Hughes is a very young man. There's one of Lena Horne. It looks like she's taking flight. She's just going up in the air. Beautiful one of Sarah Vaughan. Anyway, that exhibition is called Let Your Motto Be Resistance, and it's still traveling the nation. Then we did an exhibition based on a family of photographers, a father and his sons, who were based in Washington. And in many cities across the country, there are African-American photographers who've chronicled the history of the community there, of the larger community, of the African-American community, of weddings and funerals and social occasions and political strife. And so the Scurlock family, the Scurlock men, who did my wife's baby pictures, my baby pictures, my parents' pictures before I was born, we did an exhibition of the Scurlock studios and had comment cards that really interested a local audience. So people would say, the third woman on the left is my grandmother's sister, and her name is such and such and such. So you have an audience informing you of who is in these images. We had a picture of the late Dorothy Height as a young woman surrounded by women from the National Council of Negro Women. And our curator, Paul Gardullo, took it to Dorothy. And she looked at the picture, and she closed her eyes for a period of time. He thought she was dozing off. She was reflecting on that day and who these women were and why they were gathered that day. And then she spoke and she explained who all the people were, what the circumstances were, what the issue they were combating was, and why they gathered that day. So photographs help you bring back memories and fill in details that those of us living now don't know. And so that was a really incredible experience for the curator and for the staff. And we kept all those comment cards. The collection doesn't belong to us, it belongs to American History. But American History hadn't put it out there for people to respond to. Then we did a really fun exhibition, Talisa Fleming was the curator, on the Apollo Theater that was celebrating its 75th anniversary. And we worked with the Apollo, who has the files of all of those entertainers, musicians, comedians, dancers, who made their debut at the Apollo. And the person who owned the Apollo kept notes on these people. And Leslie Uggams, for example, went there as a little girl, I think she was 7, to perform for the first time. And he kept records of her until she grew into adulthood and how she captivated the audiences. So it also that exhibition allowed us to go to some of these artists and ask for materials from their own collections, costumes, clothing, instruments, because we were thirsty for the artifacts, the real thing. We're the Smithsonian, you have to have the real thing, tell the story. We're looking for a slave ship. Anybody out there have access to a slave ship? I did this in Barbados, and someone came to me and said, I have one. So, you may have a home in Jamaica or something. Anybody got a slave ship? Come talk to me after this. The next exhibition was on collectors, because for museums, collectors are really key to study. And you want to appeal to collectors of various kinds of things to share their collections with you, so if they can part with something in their collections. So we featured a family of collectors, the Kinseys, and they collect both fine art and historical documents and artifacts. But it's a story of how they began to collect and why they collect and why they have a passion for collecting. Our next to last exhibition was called For All the World to See. And as you entered that exhibition, there was a huge portrait of Gordon Parks, because it looked at the image of African Americans from the 1940s, a period of deep segregation, and that transition into the civil rights movement. And there was Gordon Parks to chronicle that whole shift in image from subservient roles to positive and proud and a different way of presenting people. We looked at the popular press, we looked at television, we looked at film, both films that people protested in the 40s and then films like Shaft and films that come into the 70s and show a different way of looking at the African American experience. And most recently, and it closes next week, we have an exhibition called Slavery at Jefferson's Monticello. My father's field was 18th and 19th century history. And he went to Monticello in the 1960s and asked where the slave quarters were, and they said they don't know. And my father said, that's not possible. They said Mr. Jefferson was too meticulous and he probably designed them himself. So that the you don't know is not an adequate answer. So from that period, past Sally Hemings, into the present, we now have partnered and worked with Monticello to tell the story of 6 of the enslaved families that lived on Monticello, what their specialties were, who accompanied him to France, who was trained in French cooking, who were the carpenters. We know them by name. Jefferson inherited 60 slaves from his father. 12 of our presidents were slaveholders. We don't talk about this part of history. 12 of our presidents were slaveholders. Thomas Jefferson had 600 slaves over the course of his life. 2 of them accompanied him to university, to William and Mary. That's a whole nother chapter, universities and slavery. Harvard's first president was a slaveholder. Brown was founded by slave traders. Harvard's first endowment to build a law school came from a plantation owner. Princeton's black neighborhood started because the students that accompanied the slaves that accompanied the students to university had to have somewhere to live. So now there are conferences on universities and slavery, not just universities in the South. Fascinating stuff. Some of these exhibitions travel, and as we continue to develop exhibitions, museums such as these represented in this room, university museums and otherwise, can consider hosting these exhibitions to share this information across the nation. Now, I'd like to show you some images from our Center for African American Media Arts, and this gives you a sense of the different kinds of images we're collecting. We refer to this as a jewel within the building. It will have its own special small gallery, and it'll allow you to access collections of images from other parts of the world. The goal is to foster research, creativity, and education by providing easy access to photography and visual media about the African American experience. We feel that this is something our institution can excel in, and we're looking for partnerships. Hello. These are early renderings of what this space may look like. When you work with architects, they're continually giving you new renderings of what they think the space might look like. We're working with Ralph Applebaum as our exhibition design firm. And as I travel the world, I see work that Ralph and his team have done. They did a fabulous exhibition in a new museum in Sao Paulo called the Museum of the Portuguese Language. So you get to see what people have done working with other subject matter. These are our collecting areas for CAMA, 19th century photography, which of course is very expensive, regional US collections, cultural figures and events, civil rights photography, such as the exhibition many of you saw this evening, and film and documentary. So you see Gordon Parks fits in various of these roles. These are actually in our collections now. These are all 19th century tin types, daguerreotypes, carte de visite, and ambrotypes. Photography is really created about 1850. So it's from that point on that we have documentation of people of African descent throughout the hemisphere. There are incredible photographs in Brazil from the same time period. We have to help people understand how different the African American experience has been in different parts of the country. So in the upper left-hand corner, this is a photographer who was based in Greenville, Mississippi. A photographer based in Chicago. Jack Manning is photographing the people looking at the Elk Parade from the apartments in Harlem. This is a marvelous image of a photographer being photographing other people in Harlem, and Alexander Allen looking at the Commander Keepers, the Black Hebrew Israelites, also in Harlem in 1940. You see how Elizabeth Catlett was influenced by this image by Joe Schwartz. You have Brownsville, Brooklyn, also by Joe Schwartz in the 1930s. And Vanderzee's widow, is a friend of our family's, and she called me, she says, "Are you interested in any Vanderzee's?" And so I went to our art curators, and they said, if she's willing to give them to us. Because Vanderzee's are very, very costly. We all heard about Katrina, but did you know we had images from 1927? These are the refugees who were not allowed to leave Mississippi because they knew if they left Mississippi, the workforce would be gone. So these are the camps they set up for the survivors of the flood following the hurricane. And these are photos that belong to the Illinois Central Railroad. You never know where collections are. Some of the best collections of the Tulsa Race Riot are Red Cross photos, because the Red Cross is there to document as well as giving relief. So the Tulsa Historical Society has all the Red Cross images from 1921. There's Lena. Green pastures. Sadet Paquet is a Turkish photographer. James Baldwin lived in Turkey for a period of time, and we have a collection of the images taken of him in Turkey. We don't yet have any Gordon Parks images. Someone is considering purchasing some for us. And then we may talk to some local institutions here about long-term loans. Short term. Here's another image of James Baldwin in Istanbul, Thelonious Monk. I have been learning where the images of African American troops from World War I are located. African Americans are fighting under the French flag, and therefore the images are in the French military archives, and their movies, which we now have access to, the French filmed Black American troops. And so we will have in our military gallery films from World War I of African American troops in Europe. And then, of course, we have the Fisk Jubilee Singers. My parents met at Fisk, and the Fisk Jubilee Singers not only traveled the United States to raise money for Fisk, but traveled extensively in Europe. So we have images of African Americans outside of the United States showing how the influence, both of music, culture, literature, goes beyond our shores. And then we have a major set of collections on civil rights photography. And these are both black, and all of these are both black and white photographers. You have Spider Martin, Leonard Freed, Jim Wallace, Ernest Withers, you just saw this image upstairs, and Milton Williams of Stokely in the 60s. And then our director is a film nut, and so we're going to have a very extensive collection of digital versions of films throughout the 20th century into 21st century, as well as television. Last year, we got the scramble board from Soul Train and the Soul Train sign. And we had a concert with Soul Train and Don Cornelius' son before he passed, actually. Then, I lived outside of the country from 74 to 82. So I was absent for this phenomenon. But we got the mothership. And I got a call from one of my Boulay brothers who very seriously said, you know, you're gonna have to redesign the roof of the museum. I said, excuse me? They said, if the mothership's gonna land on the building, it has to be fireproof. So, you never know who's listening and deciding things. And this is what the museum will look like. And now, we're going to run for you a quick video. It's about 6 or 7 minutes of our groundbreaking.
It was on this ground long ago that lives were once traded.
This is an idea whose time has come.
This may be the land of the Pilgrim's pride, but it's also the land where my mothers and fathers died. So let freedom ring.
The National Museum of African American History and Culture. I just love to say that. We call the lost dream back. Today we begin to make manifest on this mall, on this sacred space, the dreams of many generations who fought for and believe that there should be a site in the nation's capital that will help all Americans remember and honor African American history and culture.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light?
This day has been a long time coming. The idea for a museum dedicated to African Americans was first put forward by Black veterans of the Civil War. And years later, the call was picked up by members of the civil rights generation. Just as the memories of our earliest days have been confined to dusty letters and faded pictures, the time will come when few people remember drinking from a colored water fountain.
I'm particularly proud of the museum's vision, which is dedicated not simply to this building, but also to reaching out to communities around the nation.
We must tell the story, the whole story, 400 years story of African American contribution to this nation's history from slavery to the present, without anger or apology.
This is a milestone. This is a milestone moment not only for the Smithsonian, but for the United States.
It must tell the unvarnished truth, because this will be a museum that will have moments to make one cry or to ponder the pain of slavery and segregation. But it will also be a signature green museum that soars on the resiliency of a people and will illuminate the joy and the belief in the promise of America that has shaped this community.
The National Museum of African American History and Culture adds essential chapters to the essential American story. Voices silenced in the past will be heard here, now, and in the future.
My soul's been anchored, my soul's been anchored in the Lord, in the Lord, in the Lord. My soul's been anchored, anchored in the Lord, in the Lord, in the Lord. My soul's been anchored in the Lord, my Lord, my soul.
In moments like this, I think about Malia and Sasha. When our children look at Harriet Tubman's shawl or Nat Turner's Bible, or the plane flown by Tuskegee Airmen, I don't want them to be seen as figures somehow larger than life. I want them to see how ordinary Americans could do extraordinary things.
Today, I want to acknowledge our youngest donors. One of my former students, Tracy Minna, worked with children at the Stuyvesant Montessori School as they celebrated the history of African Americans. So last year, these students collected $600 in coins and presented it to the museum.
Hi, how are you?
which earth and heaven ring with the harmonies of liberty.
History is written by the winners. After 400 years of struggle, of triumph, of tragedy, of turmoil, of turbulence, we won.
As members of this council, we have had the pleasure of witnessing a vision take shape. Today, we will break ground for a museum that has been a long time in the making.
May God thy gold refine, till all success, Barack Obama in the White House, till all success, Martin Luther King Jr. on the National Mall, to all success, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, till all success be nobleness and every gain divine.